This is Trend Following Radio, where great thinking comes alive. Nobel Prize winners, legendary traders, best-selling authors, and the pros that know what drive us irrational human beings. I am your host, MICHAEL COVEL. Not filtered, raw, honest. That's my passion. Let me give you a little factoid that you, because I wasn't, maybe you were, but I don't think so. You were not aware that in 1965, the United States government helped to kill 1 million people inside Indonesia. I mean, yes, they were in Vietnam at the time. Yes, they were in Cambodia. They were in Laos. But our government, the CIA, through the cloak of darkness, assisted, led, however you want to call it, to the killing of 1 million people inside Indonesia. Now, look, the CIA has surely done some good things, but post-World War II, it did a lot of bad things. My guest today, Vincent Bevins, he digs deep. His book, The Jakarta Method, Washington's Anti-Communist Crusade, and the Mass Murder Program that shaped our world. This might be one of those conversations where you say to yourself, I don't want to know. I don't care. It's not interesting to me. And you know what I would say? Fuck you. It should be interesting to you. If you're a human being, if you're alive, if you have a pulse, you want to know how things work, how things have worked, for good and bad. If you're not curious, you're dead. You're pant waste. And I think we should all be so fortunate to have curious people on this planet like Vincent. People that go deep to find stories that, let's face it, a lot of people don't want found. Every day that I do this podcast, every new episode, I say to myself, how fortunate that I am that I get to experience people that have dedicated their lives to a niche, a subject, a story, to figure something out. And it keeps me fresh. It keeps me alive. And if you listen to me on a regular basis, I'm sure as hell thinking it does the same thing for you. I promise you, this is one damn interesting story, damn sad story. But you should know it. Without any further delay, let's jump right into my conversation with Vincent Bevins and discuss the Jakarta Method. Here's where I want to get rolling with you. Some quick background on me. So I grew up in the Washington, D.C. area. I've had enough political experience, ran for political office when I was 21. Nothing big, lost, but a great experience growing up in that area. I mean, in the sense that I wish I could forget it all, in the sense once you know what's going on, it's not so fun. And I would say today, if I'm reaching for what I would consider a voice, I'm going to add you to the list, but if I'm reaching for a group of voices that I think are going to give me something straight, even if they come from different partisan poles, I was jotting down names. There's 4 guys I can think of right off the bat. Glenn Greenwald, which is where I first saw you, Matt Taibbi, Tucker Carlson, and Jonathan Turley, the professor. Those 4 guys, to me, seem like they speak truth to power, even if they come from different partisan edges. The rest of the world out there is really tough stuff. Now you, I think, you clearly are used to speaking truth to power, huh?
I mean, I've spent all of my career in mainstream foreign journalism. All of my journalistic instincts and skills were honed within that world. But this is a story that is just by its very nature clashes with existing understandings of the world and the nature of politics in the globalized 21st century. To tell this story responsibly, to be a serious or even quote unquote objective journalist, you have to sort of inevitably be controversial on this topic just because the truth of what really happened is so at odds with perceived understandings.
Let me get you to start somewhere you might not expect. I'd like to start in modern day. Because I think a lot of people have had a chance for the last 4 years to hear all kinds of news. And clearly America is a 50-50 place. There's partisan polls. The reality from my perspective is people can argue their partisan poll, but the reality is they don't control a damn thing. And there's this, what everyone wants to call it, the deep state, whatnot. There's these forces that have things moving along behind the scenes that people really don't get a chance to vote on. And I think that's going to come out in some of your experience as well, too. But let's speak to, I would like for you to open up with just a notion of the CIA today, because I think for most people in the last 4 years, they've heard the phrase, they've heard it, the CIA a lot. The whole Trump thing in Russia, this whole thing has been out there. And I'll have to say, I do kind of share a perspective that Taibbi and Greenwald come at on this topic, that sense that they're kind of like, hey, look, I'm not a huge fan of Trump. That's what they would say. I'm not a huge fan of Trump, but what the hell have we been doing for the last 4 years? With that backdrop, give me some feeling from your perspective about what has been happening in the modern American perspective, the modern American understanding of the CIA in the last 4 years. It seems like we've gone off the rails.
I think that one thing that I perhaps share with Taibbi and Greenwald on a very basic level is we've all spent a lot of time outside the United States. And I think if you look at the United States from 2016 to 2020, if you take a very broad perspective and you're not deep in it, I think it looks kind of like a country in ideological crisis. And I think to a significant extent that you had sort of a meltdown when Trump was elected. And I certainly understand why the liberal Democrat leading side of U.S. politics had such a hard time dealing with it. But I think as a result of that very deep ideological crisis, and I might go as far to say that contemporary liberalism is in crisis, not in just in the United States, but globally, you saw this kind of very strange realignment where the half of U.S. politics that had previously always hated neoconservatives, always considered the CIA a force for evil in the world, made an alliance with some of those figures in the service of anti-Trumpism. And whether or not that's tactically in their interests, I don't know. I'm not one of those partisans. But what I can say is that as I dove into the history of what the CIA really was since the beginning, the things that it's done in the decades that we know about, and meeting all the people that suffered as a result of those activities, it's very strange for me to see the CIA or the U.S. intelligence community held up as some kind of an important ally for anything, especially for the side of the aisle in American politics that likes to consider itself concerned with human rights and the equalities of peoples and liberalism more generally. So while I don't exactly have the expertise on the modern CIA that I just halfway acquired, I'm still not an expert on the 50s and 60s and 70s, it's been strange to see the contortions happening in U.S. politics in the Trump area.
Yeah, because I think that what's happening right now, you're not having access to any kind of inside information right now or anything like that, but it sure seems like when you look at some of the behavior in the last handful of years, and then we start to look at behavior in the 50s, 60s, 70s, et cetera, maybe that's the through line, is that this has always been kind of an operation that is not really beholden to anybody. I mean, it's beholden to a few people that are making decisions, but it really strikes you like, who the hell is pulling the marionette strings?
Yeah, this is something I want to write about in the future, but I could flesh it out here, that there's kind of a binary when it comes to understanding U.S. intelligence and CIA coups and plots and their role in world history. And on one hand, there's the side that says, oh, they control everything. They're all powerful. They're always pulling the strings. There's the other side that says, oh, no, they mess up all the time. They're totally irresponsible. They're laughably incompetent, and they just screw up the whole world. And I think that both of those things are wrong because both of those things can be true at the same time. And the reason they can be true at the same time is that when you are the covert operations apparatus for the most powerful country on earth, nothing was going to get you in trouble. There's no referee. You can try to do a coup in Guatemala in 1954 and fail, and then try again and fail, and then try in the third time, and then it works. It's definitely wrong that the CIA is pulling strings everywhere and always getting what they want. But it is true that when you have absolute impunity, and I mean, despite all of the horrible crimes we found out about in 1975 with the Church Committee, nobody got in trouble. At no point in the history of U.S. foreign operations, would anybody come to the conclusion that they should be careful? There's no reason for anybody to think that way. Whatever changes may have happened in the U.S. foreign policy apparatus over the last 50, 60 years, no hammer ever comes down on these characters. And often, in the case of the people who very loudly led us to a catastrophic war in Iraq, they could all come back 10, 15 years later as in the guise of anti-Trump Republicans or whatever. And until now, there has been no punishment for anybody assisting or carrying out atrocities on behalf of the U.S. government. Yeah.
When I start to go through your world, your work, and I look at the last 4 years of messaging and whether or not there's some truth to it, there doesn't seem to be a lot, if there is any truth to it. But the notion of Trump, Putin, Soviets, Russia, communism, etc., and then I trace it back decades and decades and decades back in your work, and it's like, wow, this has been going on for a long time. This is not a new thing to tar and feather anyone with, is it?
Oh, no. In the wake of the election of Donald Trump, I absolutely don't think that Vladimir Putin is blameless or that one should deny the seriousness of what he might have done in 2016. But at the same time, I do believe that a lot of the reaction may have been just flexing a muscle that already existed. Just there was that muscle memory to, rather than look at other things that may have caused an election to happen, the easy thing to do is to go back to that thing we know how to do, which is you blame the Russians and you put everything on a foreign enemy. And it was right there.
Both sides have done this for decades. It's not just one side.
Oh, no, absolutely, absolutely. And it just happened to be the case that in 2018, that the liberals were sort of reeling, I think, from a very unexpected and very difficult loss. It goes back and forth. I mean, again, I don't think China is blameless when it comes to their early handling of the coronavirus, but I think it's going to be very easy to just blame everything on a bad foreign power. As you say, this muscle we've developed over decades, if not centuries of American history, I think it gets flexed too quickly sometimes to throw everything on the big bad foreign enemy with a secret international plot. Because the reality is we're the most powerful country. We've been the most powerful country for a very long time. If we want to have a full explanation of what's going wrong, we're usually the first place we should look.
Okay, so if I take it back in time, so we get through World War II, I think most people, regardless of their partisan stripe across the planet, would say the Americans did pretty good. Okay, there's all kinds of things that people would have liked to have done better. Dropping nukes if we didn't have to do that. Sure, there's all kinds of things. But I think most people would say a real wave of perhaps good things started to unfold, or at least the notion of what happened to stop the war, the Americans got credit for. We got credit for. I'm an American. And a lot of that was about, hey, look, let's stop Stalin. Let's stop the Soviets. Let's win the Cold War, etc. Look, I'm 51. So in 1984, 85, I mean, it was still in the middle of the Cold War. I thought they'd send me somewhere. So what was the pivot? What was the first moment where we really pivoted post-World War II, where we started to go down this path that you really open up in your world, your work? The bad path.
The short answer, I think, is Iran 1953. The long answer is that I agree with you that, I put it this way in the book, that the United States is a country with some very dark foundational elements. There was the genocide of native peoples, there was slavery, but there was also this revolutionary tradition, this yet unrealized ideal of full citizenship for everyone. And I think in World War II, we were the good guys. We were not the only good guys, but the positive side of our nature really came to the fore, and we rightfully enjoyed global prestige as a result of the heroic efforts of lots of young Americans fighting fascism. Now, a lot of those same guys that fought in World War II got hired by the covert operations, the new covert operations force of the United States, which was called the CIA. And we didn't have one before this. The British did because they'd been running an empire for a very long time. The Russians did because they had inherited some spycraft expertise from the Russian Empire, and then also the early years of the Soviet Union, they felt that they were attacked from all sides, which was basically true. The United States did not have this until the CIA was founded in the immediate aftermath of the Cold War. And the guys that were picked for this tended to be liberal, cosmopolitan, blue blood elites, so Yale guys that considered themselves very globally minded and forward thinking. And they were given a lot of money, and they were given the task of fighting communism. The thing is that when they tried to take on the actual Soviet bloc, they failed. In the early years of the CIA, they were parachuting people into Soviet-controlled areas of Eastern Europe. They were trying to run covert operations in Korea. All of this failed. And the reason it failed is because the actual secret police of the Soviet Union and its new allies or countries under its dominion were good enough to catch them. But still, you have these guys that want to get something done. They have this remit. They have all this money. They come from the kind of culture where they're supposed to be performing. They want to show that they're doing a good job. And so they turn to the third world.
Why don't you define the first, second, and third world from your perspective?
Absolutely. I think the word third world has become sort of pejorative in the English language now because people used it in such a horrible way for a very long time. But I find that that division is pretty useful, especially when you're talking about 1945. Because in the original iteration of third world, it was an entirely positive, optimistic, hopeful project. So the first world at the end of World War II was the rich countries that had engaged in imperialism or colonialism of some kind. So Western Europe, United States, Japan. The second world was the Soviet Union and the countries that it had just occupied in World War II. Russia itself, all of the Central Asian Soviet republics, and then up to the Iron Curtain, as it were. And the third world is the rest of humanity, and that is the vast majority of the world's peoples. And the vast majority of the world's peoples had lived under European colonialism for decades, if not hundreds of years, and they had really suffered from this. This was essentially slavery. This is the kind of horrible oppression that the American revolutionary tradition recognizes as something that is unjust and needs to be undone. So when the third world came together in the first years after World War II, they had this project that finally we're going to take our place on the world stage. We finally have our freedom, so we're going to stand up alongside the white people that used to control us and alongside the communists that we don't want to be like them. We also don't really hate them, and we want to take our place alongside those other major powers. And when the CIA, after failing in Eastern Europe, turns to the third world, even sympathetic historians of the agency recognize that they didn't really understand what the third world was. These were all guys that had studied in prep schools in the Eastern Corridor that were modeled on English prep schools. They all fancied themselves great European intellectuals, but they had very little idea of what an Iranian or a Guatemalan or a Congolese
or Vietnamese
is a very good example. I mean, you're in Vietnam, and one of the more tragically paradoxical moments of this history is that even Ho Chi Minh, who was definitely a communist and was definitely hard-nosed about his attitudes towards the West, in 1945, when he declared independence from France, he quoted the Declaration of Independence of the United States as in a very obvious attempt to associate the third world independence movements with the American revolutionary tradition, because he didn't want to go to war with the most powerful country on earth, and he thought that this could work out. Of course, instead of telling Ho Chi Minh, okay, well, we can be sort of friends with you as long as you be the best kind of leader you can be, we helped the French try to reconquer Vietnam. In the first quote-unquote success of this new CIA is in Iran in 1953. Even though the war on communism was used to a large extent to justify the intervention that overthrew Iran's democracy, it was very tied up with old European imperial interests. So it was really the British that were pressing the US to get involved. The British were really worried about their oil interests in Iran. The British had controlled this strip of Asia for a very long time, and they got the CIA to organize, press for, and successfully carry out a coup that installed the Shah for a very long time. And this was seen, finally, for the CIA and for President Eisenhower as a huge success. Finally, this thing we've created that was failing everywhere, it works. We've, number one, stopped communism, quote unquote, even though the leader was not communist at all. And two, we've scored a big victory for the corporate interests, which are so important to US strategy around the world. And after that, you start to see the attempt to reproduce this quote unquote success in other parts of the third world. I think that's the turning point. I kind of try to draw this sort of dramatically in the book that after World War II, there's kind of a fork in the road. And On the one hand, are we going to use this new status as the most powerful nation in history to affirm the revolutionary ideals upon which the country was founded? Or are we going to occupy the same kind of space that the European imperialists occupied? And I think in 1953, we took a hard turn towards the latter option.
There's an issue here, a base level issue that I still see with friends of mine today, especially conservative friends. Now, look, obviously, you know where I'm calling you from, and you can probably guess that I've, in a handful of years, have figured out a little bit about history that I might not have known before. So again, as you say about Taibbi and Greenwald and yourself, when you spend a little time outside the States, you get a different perspective. I think the thing that a lot of people in the States still have no clue about when they start to talk about even mainland China or other communist countries, there's only a handful left around the world, is that these countries, because of colonialism, had shit except for people. They had massive populations. And in many ways, at least from my perspective, and you might go a lot more deeper than this than me, this was a rallying cry. Communism was a rallying cry to say, hey, see all those white guys over there, those French guys, those British guys? If we group together, we can beat them because we have people power. They might have everything else, but they can't defeat our populations. And that's essentially what happened, isn't it?
Yeah. I mean, there's a scene in the book that I outline where John F. Kennedy and Bobby Kennedy, because they want to be foreign policy experts, because they have the money to do so, they're traveling all around the world. And Nehru, the leader of India at the time, he says this to Bobby Kennedy. He says, and we have Bobby Kennedy, because he furiously jots this down. He says, look, communism is giving people something to fight for. And he's not a communist. He's just trying to explain the boneheadedness of the American approach to the third world at the time. He tells Bobby Kennedy, look, communism is giving people something to fight for. All you're offering them is the status quo. And it was not really clear. It was clear to some very cynical actors in the U.S. foreign policy establishment, which we can talk about. But it was not very clear to a lot of people in the United States just how terrible that status quo was. So Indonesia, which is now the fourth largest country in the world by population, when they came out of centuries of Dutch rule, only 5% of the Indonesian population could read and write. And this was on purpose. Indonesia was treated as a giant export
slave colony.
Yeah, it was a giant extraction center for natural resources. When I sat down with a lot of elderly people from this part of Asia or Latin America, when they came out of World War II in 1946, 47, they knew that Europe was racist and had enslaved them for hundreds of years. They didn't know exactly what America was going to do as a new leader of the world, but they knew that also America was racist and that they were friends with the Europeans. So when the United States starts helping the French to recolonize Vietnam, when they see the overthrow of democracy in Iran and Guatemala, and they're paying very close attention. This was not huge news in the United States, but this was huge news in the third world. They came to the conclusion, it's like, okay, well, then the United States is like the old white people, and they're imperialists. And even though the Soviet Union may not be the best place in the world to live, they haven't done anything to me. Stalin's crimes don't even come out until the 50s. But even when they do, if you're Indonesian and you're looking out at the world, a lot of them thought, look, the United States is doing what the Europeans did. The United States is clearly a racist place. The Soviet Union did not do anything to me. And so a small amount of people in the third world became dedicated allies of the Soviet Union. There were dedicated Marxist-Leninist parties. But a really large contingent wanted to be non-aligned, which was to say, we're not joining Washington's military alliance. We're not helping out as you try to reconquer Vietnam with the French, but we're also not aligning with the Soviet Union. So what we want is we want our good relations with both, because frankly, we desperately need aid from both countries. We're, like you said, we have nothing. We need advisors, we need loans. We can't afford to fight a Cold War. We need to be friends with everyone. We just don't have that luxury. And under Truman, there was a brief period in which it was considered tolerable for nations in the third world to be neutral. Under Eisenhower, and after the quote-unquote success of Iran, neutrality was seen as being the enemy. After 1953, if you were not explicitly in an alliance with the United States, then you were, if not on the chopping block for intervention, an intervention against you could be justified if it became necessary. This is what happens throughout the 50s and 60s. And again, although in the US we kind of put this in a part of our memory where like that doesn't count, that was an abuse, that was people running wild, that's not what we really stand for. If you were in Morocco or Chile or South Africa in 1955 and you were looking at this, you came to the conclusion that is what the United States is. That's what they're going to do. So we need to either come together and form some kind of alliance or to get into a defensive position in preparation for some kind of an intervention here. This is a maddening bit of cognitive dissonance among U.S. policymakers in the 50s and 60s, is that even while all these coups are happening and even while they're very obviously trying to help France reconquer a colony in the second half of the 20th century, they don't understand why people around the world don't trust them or don't want to be in an alliance. They're like, well, these people must be crazy, or they must be irresponsible. And to a large extent, racism was involved, and especially if these peoples were African or Asian, they'd be like, oh, these people are immature, they're children, they don't understand. People understood what it meant that the United States was toppling these regimes.
I've been listening to how you lay this out, and I'm trying to find, because I'm sure some other people listening perhaps will be looking for the same thing, I'm looking for your partisan pole, your angle. And I'm sure you've got one, but in everything you're describing to me, this is just straightforward. I don't know what the argument could be. I mean, this is history. This is what happened. I hope people, when they hear what you're saying, they don't get triggered because, I mean, let's face it, I really think about at least 50% of America, if they hear the word communism, they start shaking. In 2020, they start shaking. It's nuts. Let me bring you up to 1965. I've been to Bali briefly. It's a little bit different. It's a Hindu island. But take me to 1965. Take me to getting into the Jakarta Method, because this is such an interesting phrase, the Jakarta Method. But what happened in Indonesia in the middle of the Vietnam War, as they might call it, the American War, not as they might, as they do call it the American War. But take me to 1965 Indonesia.
This picture that I've drawn of countries in the third world wanting to stay out of Washington's way, but also not trusting them, this non-aligned movement, this movement of the neutral third world, the most prominent leader of this movement was Sukarno, who was the founding father of Indonesia. He was a man that was very visionary in terms of bringing together the thousands of islands and dozens of ethnicities and many religions and hundreds of languages into one sort of national ideology. And he was the George Washington of Indonesia. In 1955, as he starts to organize these first major conferences of African and Asian peoples, and as the Communist Party in Indonesia starts to do better and better in his young democracy, the CIA tries to turn its tools on him. So in 1955, they fund a right-wing conservative party, a Muslim party, in the attempt to stop the Communist Party from winning elections. It doesn't work. The communists still do better and better.
Before you get rolling, lay out for people your research angle here, because as you say this, some people are going to immediately say, well, how the hell does he know this is a story he's telling? You've been working with a lot of data and a lot of documents going back a long time, and we're talking about U.S. government documents.
Right. I spent 3 years working on this myself. What the book really does is it combines probably 5 or 6 centuries of academic research, declassified documents coming out of Washington, and then me doing 125 to 150 interviews in 12 countries in 4 languages to fill in the human side of this. The picture that I'm painting right now about U.S., the CIA funding Massumi, the conservative Muslim party, that's declassified information. What Richard Nixon said as vice president at the time is also declassified. He said, quote, a democratic government is probably not the best kind for Indonesia because, quote, the communists could probably not be beaten in election campaigns because they were so well organized. They realized in the middle of the 50s, okay, the communists are doing too well. And again, they're not running the country. They're just winning a sizable chunk in parliament. And then in 1958, the CIA invades the country. In 1958, there is a actual bombing campaign of Indonesia, and an American pilot is caught because he crash lands, survives, and they find his identifying papers on him. And this is further proof to the skeptical voices in Indonesia that the United States is trying to break our country to pieces, which is exactly what was happening. But at that point, they got caught. This was kind of a Bay of Pigs moment in Asia. They really got caught with their pants down. There was nothing they could say or do to deny this. I mean, the guy was on TV being paraded by the Indonesian left. And so they switched tactics, especially with the arrival of John F. Kennedy. But from 1958 to 1964, they kind of are friendly with Sukarno, this founding father, while training and arming the U.S. military in Kansas. And thousands of officers come to Kansas to get training. And in my book, one of the main characters, and the book is told through the personal narratives of people whose lives crisscrossed with this bigger story. And one of the guys that I got to know quite well was in Kansas at the time and hanging out in bars and going out on the town with these Indonesian officers that were getting trained by the United States. But the idea was to get them to be pro-American and anti-communist, and to a large extent that worked. Now, in the 60s, two things happen which change Washington's posture again. Two things happen which cause the U.S. foreign policy establishment to once again treat Indonesia as a target. The first is that John F. Kennedy is killed. And when John F. Kennedy is killed, the very tenuous alliance between Washington and Indonesia falls apart. Lyndon Johnson doesn't want to spend political capital maintaining this alliance. And two, Sukarno picks a fight with Great Britain in Malaysia over the creation of a new post-colonial state that he believes that lines are being intentionally drawn in the map to weaken him, which is basically true. But he ends up picking a fight with Great Britain, and the United States entirely changes its orientation towards Indonesia. And they switch out the ambassador. They bring in a new ambassador who is widely understood to be somebody that's there to carry out regime change. And we still don't know exactly what it is that the CIA and MI6 did in 1964 and 1965. So these files are declassified, even though I tried to get access, didn't work. But we know what they wanted to happen was a clash between the US-backed right-wing military and the unarmed Communist Party, because they knew in any such clash, the army would win, because the Indonesian Communist Party, and this is very different from what people in the US tend to think about when they hear communist these days, but the Indonesian Communist Party was a very old school communist party in the sense that they believed you had to build capitalism first, and then you would build socialism. So their short-term and medium-term goal was just to support President Sukarno, support anti-colonial struggles, and then 50 years later, 40 years later, as they put it, make a transition to socialism. MI6 and CIA knew that if a clash happened between the army and the Communist Party would have no chance. In a very mysterious manner, in a manner we still do not understand, on September 30th, 1965, this clash erupts. There is some kind of a plot to arrest generals that other military officers claim are going to organize a right-wing coup. For reasons we don't understand, 6 of these generals are killed. But what we do know is that this clash has been created. The desired conflict between the Indonesian right and the Indonesian left can now take place. And so immediately, General Suharto, who is a right-wing general in the Indonesian military, seizes control of the country, shuts down all media that he does not control, and spreads an intentional lie to say that it was actually the Indonesian Communist Party that was behind this uprising, that they actually took these 6 generals, performed a horrible, sexual, satanic, murderous dance upon them in which women associated with the Communist Party castrated these men as part of some wicked communist witchcraft. And this becomes the narrative that is spread throughout the country. He controls all media. It's entirely false. We know that no members of the Indonesian women's movement were involved in this. But this story is sort of the perfect way to whip up hatred of the Communist Party in a country where 2 weeks previously, 25 or 30% of the country was a communist voter. From the very beginning, we now know from declassified files and in the book, and you can read exactly what the embassy is saying to Washington, and you can see exactly the way that the U.S. government is interacting with the generals. From the very beginning, the U.S. government sees it as its role to help spread this propaganda story, which they do, to help Suharto establish power, which they do, to help Suharto crush the communists, which they do, and to encourage the destruction of the Communist Party, which they do. We don't know whose idea it was to start killing people. We don't know if this was something that had been planned for a long time or if it was something that arose spontaneously from circumstances. We don't know if Suharto came up with it on his own or if it had been planned in concert with some foreign actors for a long time. But we know that soon after the mass arrests start, mass killings start. And the U.S. government gets reports of the mass killings, and they continue to encourage the destruction of the Communist Party, knowing fully well that that means the mass killings that are taking place. In one case, we know because someone came forward and just told the Washington Post he said that he handed lists over to the Indonesian generals, communists, so that they could cross their names off in the most horrible fashion you can imagine. And so I met a lot of the people that were swept up in this violence, people that had been either working at a union and so therefore were arrested, or wanted to be a teacher, so were in a association somehow linked with the Communist Party, or people that were just fully in the Communist Party. And across the board, these people, when they went into prison, they thought that they would be fine. They thought that they were just going to be interviewed. They were going to explain what was going on. It was just kind of a precautionary measure. Then they would be released. But to their horror, they found that when they were in jail, some people would be taken away, maybe in the middle of the night. Maybe they would disappear at some point. They would just never come back. And this tactic of overseeing the execution of innocent people took the lives of 500,000 to 1 million, maybe more people. And it allowed the Indonesian general Suharto to take power. This was not sort of vengeful violence. This was not retroactive punishment after he took power. He would not have been able to become the dictator if he had not crushed and terrified the left of the country, because it was 30% of the country. So with 1 million people dead, another 1 million people in concentration camps, everybody else that had been sympathetic to Sukarno, sympathetic to the Communist Party, and these two entities were not the same, but Sukarno was to the left of the army for sure. All these people shut their mouths, and they shut their mouths until this day. It's still very hard to get elderly Indonesians to talk about what they were doing in the 60s or what their political beliefs were, because it became very clear in 1965, 66, if you admit that you are sympathetic with the largest party at the time, and again, we know from declassified files that even CIA and MI6 recognized they would win elections if they had continued to take place after 1958, they would have won. Everybody shut their mouth.
If I go back in time in the memory banks, I can remember watching Oliver Stone's JFK at whatever point in time that came out. I remember thinking, okay, this is batshit crazy. This is just off the hook. Conspiracy theories, all kinds of stuff. I roll forward. I gain a few more years in life. I find out a few more things that have happened in this part of the world. And you start to scratch your head, because to me, it really does seem like that when JFK was killed, and you just laid out one example, I think another example of LBJ's efforts can be seen in what happened in Vietnam. I mean, the massive buildup had not taken place under JFK. But when he was gone, it was like the decks were cleared. I mean, was Johnson an empty vessel, or was he actively engaged with all of this stuff around this part of the world?
Johnson was less willing to stand up to the foreign policy, quote-unquote, experts around him. Johnson, as you can imagine, comes into office in a very difficult position. The president's been killed. Nobody knows why or how. I think that we still don't know why or how technically. And Kennedy had always fancied himself a foreign policy expert. This was his deal at Harvard. He had written a book about this. Johnson was not a foreign policy expert. So to a large extent, when...
He was a good old boy political animal from Texas.
Yes, he was very good at the Senate. He was very good at running D.C. He didn't really understand the rest of the world, and even sympathetic biographers say that he kind of just thought the rest of the world was like America. He just didn't really get it. But also, he didn't want to spend political capital standing up to the foreign policy advisors around him. So to a large extent, he just kind of did what they said he should do. And in the case of Indonesia, I think the Indonesia tragedy is one of the most important and most underappreciated consequences of Kennedy's death, because Howard Jones, the ambassador who had been in Indonesia, very energetically trying to maintain good relations between the two countries, he in his memoir says that JFK would not have abandoned this stance. And Johnson did, and he kind of doesn't, he's very diplomatic. He doesn't really blame Johnson. He says it's difficult for him to keep this going in Washington, but basically it's a fight that Johnson doesn't want to pick. Johnson lets the people around him in political establishment in Washington, D.C. tell him that he needs to stop putting up with this communist troublemaker in Indonesia.
One of the most interesting conversations I've had with a historian that came on this show, he was talking about his work and research into digging into the MacArthur-JFK relationship. And MacArthur told JFK, don't get into a land war in Asia. And I asked this guy, and I think this author came from a more conservative perspective, but I said, look, Do you think that there's any chance that JFK would have done in Vietnam what LBJ said? And he's like, I just can't see it. He goes, I can't see JFK would have done that.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, JFK certainly didn't have his hands clean in the second half of the 50s.
Not as clean, but comparatively to what happened.
That's what I was going to say, is that there was sort of the cynical way to be sort of neo-colonial or imperialist, and there's the incompetent way. And arguably, getting U.S. troops on the ground in Vietnam was the incompetent way. I mean, JFK only weeks before his own death had the president of South Vietnam killed. JFK had enough of the ally that the United States had in the very tenuous and strange South Vietnamese government. President Diem, I don't know, you might know how to pronounce that better than me. Is it? Some people say Diem. Huh?
Diem.
Yeah, Diem. Diem, President Diem. Kennedy had him killed. Not fully on purpose. He only asked for a coup, but when you order a coup in Saigon in 1963, the guy gets killed. But, I mean, that's a very good question. Would Kennedy have tried to stick to sort of more cloak and dagger operations? Would he tried to do something entirely different? Or would he also would have put American troops on the ground in Vietnam? I don't know. What I do know is that this far more consequential and far more important Cold War turning point, which was Indonesia, ends up overshadowed by Vietnam because Vietnam involves American boys. Even though Indonesia is a much more important country, and everybody understood this in the early 1960s, Kennedy's administration understood this, Johnson's administrations understood this, Vietnam ends up becoming the giant thing that hangs over the American psyche because American citizens get involved in this unending, horrific conflict that we don't win. Whereas the quote-unquote victory of Indonesia happens in 4 to 6 months and no American soldiers get hurt. There's not a scratch on the head of a single American. So it just kind of, it falls immediately deep into the memory hole because this horrible conflict in Vietnam ends up dominating U.S. ideas about Asia for the next 10 years.
So this Indonesian conquest, whatever one wants to call it, it's successful. This becomes the title of your book. I mean, not because of that, but the Jakarta Method, it's successful. So this becomes a phrase that is used in circles, correct?
Yes. As I said, we've totally forgotten about it now, but people active in the international left and right in 1964, 65, they really knew about Sukarno. They really knew about the Indonesian Communist Party. This was a hugely important country. And on the one hand, on the left side of the aisle around the world, a lot of socialist movements radicalized, believing that if they didn't become more dictatorial, if they didn't become more militaristic, they could be killed too. And then on the right side of the aisle, among Washington's allies and potential allies in the anti-communist international movement, especially in Latin America, but also in parts of Asia, everyone saw, okay, well, that works. Not only does it work, you get away with it. Not only did Suharto establish power very effectively, he entered the team of favored nations. He's now a friend of the free world. He's now a business partner of Wall Street. He is now accepted into the gang of quote-unquote good guys on the globe. So not only can we do that if we need to, it'll work, we'll get away with it. Washington will play defense for us. And this is exactly what happens in Latin America. The phrase Jakarta as metaphor for mass murder, it's kind of accidental that it was Jakarta because Jakarta wasn't even the worst violence. Most of the violence happened out in the countryside where it was easier to hide what you were doing. But in 1970, Salvador Allende is elected president of Chile. And Salvador Allende is a friend of Fidel. He is very much a leftist, but he believes in the democratic path to socialism. Now, Richard Nixon, who was the same vice president that said that democracy was a bad thing for Indonesia because the left was going to win, Richard Nixon orders the CIA to stop Allende from even taking office. We now, again, know from declassified files, we can see the conversations Nixon had. His problem with Allende was not that he thought he was going to form an alliance with Moscow or that he would ruin Chile. His fear was precisely that Allende would be successful and inspire other countries to try democratic socialism. This could not be tolerated. As Allende takes office, because the initial CIA attempts at a coup fail, and this is the same kind of thing we see over and over. They try and they fail and they try and they get caught and they try and it's a big mess, but they don't have to stop. So Allende is president, and the Brazilian US-backed dictatorship, which took over in 1964 in a process broadly similar to what happened in Indonesia, although not nearly as violent, The Brazilian military is collaborating with the Chilean military to try to help them do a coup. They're giving them advice, and they're talking about how the Chilean military could prepare the grounds to take over from Allende and create their own right-wing dictatorship. So in 1972, on the streets of Salvador, graffiti starts appearing, and that graffiti says, "Jakarta is coming." And people get postcards in the mail, and it says, "Jakarta is coming," or just Jakarta. And the message that this sends is very clear to people that have been paying attention to world history in the last 5 to 10 years, that this means we're going to kill you. This means we're going to do what they did in Indonesia. We're going to take power away from you, and you're going to die. I spent a lot of time getting to know a Chilean woman who got one of these postcards. And very tragically, that's exactly what happened. In 1973, the coup happens, and Jakarta does come. They killed her husband. They killed thousands of people in Chile. Chile and Brazil end up forming, along with other countries in South America, a grand alliance to carry out terror against each other's population. They create something called Operation Condor, which is an apparatus, again, supported by the United States, which would allow them to hunt down and kill people across the continent, even if they had escaped from this or that dictatorship. And again, those people on the right that thought we can get away with this and Washington will play defense for us, they were right. That's exactly what happened.
As we wind down, I think one of the things that strikes me about this conversation are labels, that we have these labels. And to me, it sure looks like when I go through your work, the little bit that I know about history, that in every country, regardless of its place and its timeline of where it is and its development, coming out of a war, going into a war, whatnot, that invariably there is going to be people at the top that are there with power, whatever they call themselves. I mean, like right now, plenty of Americans want to think that we are this republic, we're this democracy, everything is super fair and all this other. Give me a break. Everyone that goes to DC right now is getting super rich. You know, I mean, come on. I mean, Hillary Clinton's worth $250 million. I mean, give me a break. The reality is, it sure seems like that's what's going on. Then for me, it seems like that if we can all kind of analyze each country and whatnot, it comes down to, is there a ruler, is there a leader of that country that is benevolent? Singapore is very small. But I always say to people, like, look, Singapore is small. Okay, we can't extrapolate too much from that. And I'm sure he's got mistakes somewhere. But when I look at Lee Kuan Yew and I say, okay, you know, he's a benevolent dictator. Living under a benevolent dictator, if you truly have one. Americans, we like to say, we got all these votes. We can vote. Okay, give me a break. Give me a break. I mean, the reality is people just want to be able to get up, work, make some money, go to a restaurant, eat, hang out, have some freedom. And there's a lot of different ways to get there.
Yeah, well, when I moved to Asia, and I'm sure this is an experience you had as well, is that you meet people that straight up aren't Democrats. You meet people in Asia that are straight up like, no, it's a bad system. I mean, I'm an American. That doesn't enter into my brain as a possible thought. But what I will say is that if it's even possible to look at our system and think that it's such an imperfect democracy that it's comparable to a quote unquote benevolent dictator, that's a big problem. I do think that no matter how much I believe in democracy, it's not looking good. At the very least, we're having a bad PR moment in world history. People in Asia that look at the United States and say, well, okay, should we do that? It doesn't look great right now. And I think that every person does have a vote. I don't think there's some dark power that pulls the strings. I think everyone has a vote, and I think this is uncontroversial. Liberal academics and conservative thinkers and people on the far left all kind of recognize that if you, in the liberal capitalist system, in the free market representative democracy that we have in the United States, if you have economic power, that translates to political power. So while everybody has a vote, if you have a lot of money, you have a lot more influence over the state. And I think that's not controversial, really. We don't maybe like to talk about it that much.
I don't see it's controversial at all. But again, you're right. I don't think in America, we don't like to talk about that. We go bound to
We don't like to talk about the consequences of what that means, right? And looking at all these covert operations, there was this big recurring question. It's like, well, did America try to topple these countries and do these horrible things because they were too worried about communism? Or was it big financial interests that pressed them to do it? I don't think it has to be either or.
Is there a third option, as you mentioned, for example, with LBJ, that just some of our decision makers were just fucking idiots?
I think that all of human history, that's about a third of the explanation, no matter what happens.
Excuse my French.
At any moment in human history, the contingency inserted to the system by human stupidity is always present. But I think to understand fully the actions of the United States, what kind of an entity it is and how it interacts around the world, you have to be conscious of the fact that economic power translates into control over the state. Not full control. I don't think there's someone behind the curtain pulling all the strings, but you have much more power over, we don't hide it, right? That's why lobbyists exist. That's why major corporations spend millions of dollars to influence the government. It works. If we enter an era of extreme inequality, as we have recently, that only becomes more pronounced. While everybody still has a vote, and that matters. You can tell elections matter because even the very powerful people freak out about their outcomes. I think they really matter and every vote matters. But the greater extent to which we have a tiny class of people with huge amounts of political power, the more that we're going to see them having influence over the state. And I think this is especially true in foreign policy because foreign policy is a lot to think about. I mean, for the average American that wants to go through the day, that wants to work, go to the restaurant, have a nice time with their family, get a good night's sleep, it's very hard to keep up what's happening in 180 countries around the world. As a result of that dynamic, I think that the vote that each person has becomes relatively smaller when it comes to foreign policy because the average American doesn't have interest in Indonesia. Whereas a couple big corporations really might, and a couple sectors within the foreign policy establishment really might. Yeah, I think we have to be mindful of the way that democracy can be distorted by economic power.
Let me share one with you really quick as we close out. The first time I was in mainland China, 2013, I landed on a red eye from Bangkok. I was going for a speaking gig, so okay, yes, they're going to be nice to me and all that kind of stuff, whatever. What I'm going to tell you has never happened anywhere else. I land on a red eye. It's like 5:30. I look like a bag of you-know-what. 5:30 a.m. They meet me at the airport, 3 guys and this one chubby lady who's like 5 foot tall. And she is holding a massive bouquet of flowers to hand me. I spent a couple weeks there, go all around. Everyone's nice to me. Okay, you can feel it's different. It's whatever. But I look at something like 2020. Okay, yes, this has happened. This virus is terrible. And perhaps things have been covered up in Wuhan and all kinds of stuff. And perhaps this and perhaps that. Maybe we'll find out some really bad things. Okay, America's done some really bad things too, as you mentioned in the very beginning of this conversation. But the reality is, in 2020, when I hear Americans just start screaming, China, communist, bad, and I'm thinking, you have never been there. You have never broke bread with these folks. You've never tried to use chopsticks even,
And I mean, I absolutely believe that the Chinese government is guilty of very serious human rights abuses. And I think in a lot of ways, I would not want to live under that system. However, do I think that the United States is freaking out about China because they are mistreating Muslims in Western China? Or do I think that it is a defensive power move as they sense the arrival of another competing power? Unfortunately, I think the second one is more likely. I mean, if the United States really, really cared about the treatment of Muslims in the quote-unquote war on terror, we wouldn't have killed hundreds of thousands in Iraq.
Do you ever get a headache that you know too much?
I mean, this book, I'm okay now, and I feel very even sort of guilty or pathetic to admit this because the people that I spent time getting to know over the last 3 years have been through actual suffering. But this book was very difficult psychologically to go through. I mean, not only are just the stories awful, just it's so hard to integrate the knowledge of what happened in that part of the world and how much it shaped globalization to this day, and also just live my normal life. Drive my car and stop at Subway and pick which kind of sauce I want on the sandwich or whatever. Like, it was a sort of profoundly jarring cognitive dissonance that I went through.
I hope the CIA doesn't pick you up.
I think that they know that I don't matter. I think that they know. I think that they know. I mean, I'm not like the whistleblower or whatever, It's been the heroic
But
work
sometimes the storyteller, the synthesizer, pulls it all together, right? It was good talking to you, though. Seriously. I mean, even if you go away,
thank you so much.
No.
Oh, yeah.
I mean, it's good talking with you even if you go away.
Hopefully
you won't go away.
I don't know. We're all going away eventually. It's fine. I'll be all right.
I didn't mean that going away of the podcast. I meant, the other going away.
Yeah, I know. That's fine.
So listen, the book, The Jakarta Method, Washington's Anti-Communist Crusade, the mass murder program that shaped our world. That's a pretty grabbing title. I really think it's a great history lesson. It really, post-World War II, it gives people a perspective. Look, a lot of good things have happened in the world too. And even when I was trying to say some good things about China, you reminded me like, hey, hold on, Mike, there's some bad things going on too. But I think there's always these poles in any country where there's some good and some bad. I love the fact that you've taken the time to put this together. I know how much time it must have taken, just a tremendous amount of work.
Thanks for having me and thanks for looking at it. I appreciate anybody that has the time to read it and think through these issues with me.
Hey, where is the best place to send people? The book, Amazon, all those fun places. Is there a website you want to drive people to? A Twitter account, anything?
People can buy the book wherever they want. On my own personal website, I set up a page, which is just the jakartamethod.com, which is an easy way to remember it. And that'll send you to all kinds of different options, including around the world, or if you want to avoid Amazon. But really, it's everywhere. And yeah, I'm on Twitter as well, Vincent Bevins. People want to follow me. I'm in Brazil now, sort of trying to keep up day to day with the consequences of the Bolsonaro government during this pandemic. And he, of course, his legacy is the same as the Jakarta Method too. I just appreciate any interest anyone has in the book.
Hey, Vincent, I appreciate you coming on. Thank you.
Thank you.
I see a time when those awake will understand how to make money in up, down, and surprise markets. Whether new trader or experienced, college student or financial advisor, protecting against a crash or just trying to make a lot of money, trend following offers everyone an answer in uncertain times. To get started immediately, send me an email, michael@covel.com. I will send you the right trend following steps to take along with my free video. But if you want to buy and hold, trust the government and trust Wall Street, this is absolutely not for you.